So as a brief example, let's say I've made a decision to lie on my resume or my employment application. Does that mean it's going to get caught on the background check? People lie on resumes. They stretch the truth. They upgrade their titles. They move some dates around. I'm not telling you to lie on your resume. This video is just for educational purposes. There's a lot that you can get by just not being an asshole. No one gives a shit if you graduated high school, except maybe you or your parents. Hello, and welcome to this episode of the HR Project. Today, we're diving deep into the world of pre-employment background checks. For those of you who are new to the channel, my name is Rick, and my goal is to give you educational content of all of the behind-the-scenes action and the secrets that happen in HR. Because the better you're informed about how corporate America plays the game, the better you can prepare and come out on top. And let's start today's conversation by explaining what in the heck are pre-employment background checks to begin with. Well, pre-employment background checks are oftentimes one of the last steps you need to pass before you can start your new job. Many companies will give you offer letters stating that your job offer is contingent upon successfully doing certain things, like passing a background check. So that gives them a way to essentially get out of hiring you if you were to fail the background check, according to whatever their standards are. But it's important to note that not every company handles this process the exact same way. And one of the things you'll hear me preach about on this channel is that there is a huge difference between how a Fortune 50 or a Fortune 500 company will handle these background checks compared to how a small or medium-sized business will handle it. Keep in mind that there are 33 million small businesses in America. That's right, 33 million. 33.2 to be exact, and those are stats from the federal government, specifically the SBA or the Small Business Administration. These are businesses that are defined as having less than 500 total employees. Now, this number may sound crazy to you, and I can't say I blame you. I was surprised to hear that stat the first time I heard it, especially when you consider, usually, most people will only hear about the big companies and how they do things, right? Especially if you go to mainstream media. Every time a journalist or industry insider writes an article about the job market or career advice, they're going to be quick to point out the way companies like Tesla or Microsoft, Meta, Target, Costco, and all of these huge companies, and how they do things. But these are companies with tens of thousands of employees, hundreds of locations, even in some circumstances. It's just not going to be the same as every small businesses that's out there. The way these companies operate with their vast resources and huge HR departments is completely different than the small businesses of America. Now, is there going to be some overlap? Are some of these small businesses going to try and work their way up to the way these huge companies operate? Of course, but it's not going to be identical, and certainly not at the beginning. Most small businesses don't do a lot of this. It's just simply one of the biggest misconceptions. So while you might read an article or hear about your friend's sister who had to go through some crazy background check verifying criminal history and credits and education and employment backgrounds and all that, this just isn't what most companies do. Not every company can spend on all of these background checks, especially if they're doing a lot of hiring, and especially go to that extent of spending money on doing really in-depth background checks. I worked in consulting for years in corporate America. I looked at the back offices set up for HR for small businesses, medium-sized businesses all across the country. I can tell you a lot of things, but one of the things I can tell you is that the lack of consistency, the lack of companies doing things the same way, as if one company does thorough background checks, so therefore everyone does it. That's just it's a fallacy. It's not true. And I've seen ultimately how these companies operate. They're just kind of going to be all over the place, frankly, depending on the industry. And this brings me to my first point, and that's that background checks are outsourced to third-party companies. And I think generally society does a decent job of convincing a lot of people out there that there is some kind of master database, like some kind of computer system that has all of your personal information, or a computer system that has, your permanent record, if you will, that keeps track of everything you've ever done. And that just isn't the case. I'm sure the government would like to get to a stage where they have, this huge database with all of this information, but it just doesn't exist right now. And if it does exist and it's a secret, well, it's just not accessible to the jobs that you're applying for, unless you're applying for government jobs or a government contractor job. And even in those circumstances, they have to do these huge background checks that take forever. So ultimately, these systems just don't exist. So what are we left with? And that's where background check companies come in. They try to find all of this information about you. But it isn't always easy to get this information, and these companies charge a decent amount to even try to find it. Now, there are all sorts of background check companies out there. Drop a few companies like Hire Right. I'm sure you've heard of some of them. Good Hire, Checker, just to name a few. Basically, the company that you apply for, right, they're able to pick and choose which vendor they ultimately hire to conduct these background checks on you. So companies are free to pick and choose which vendor they hire to conduct a background check, and when they actually run the background check, they're going to order or pay for a variety of packages. Sometimes this means they're going to pay for just a standard criminal history background check. That seems to be the most common approach. Other times, they may opt to run a criminal history combined with, let's say, employment verifications or educational history. It's all up to the company to decide what they do and how much they're willing to pay. So ultimately, in the consulting world, if let's say I were advising a company of, let's say, 50 people, I would likely advise them to run a standard criminal history background check for most of their open roles, especially if they can afford it. But would I advise them to check and pay for a full workup of, let's say, criminal history, credit, employment verification, references, and educational history? Probably not. Look, that stuff gets expensive. And for a small business that's constantly engaged in this kind of push and pull of fighting for resources, it's just likely not going to be a priority, not in the early stages of a business. Again, it depends on the industry and depends on the jobs that you're applying to, but as a general rule, that kind of stands. It also takes time which I may not have or want to wait before I can get someone in the role. Every time you add an additional step to a background check, the process takes longer. And sure, a standard background check for criminal history, there's these databases out there that can get you results in like 10 minutes. They're extremely fast. But those state databases, even some of the national ones, are extremely outdated. They may not be accurate, and frankly, a lot of times they're just garbage. If you, as an employer, if you want accurate information, that means you usually have to go to the local jurisdictions or the county level to run county level checks, especially for something like criminal history. And those take a while. Depending on the county, that can take 3 to 7 days. That's just for criminal history, right? Then if you're looking at educational history, it's going to take a while to pull that information up. If you're looking at employment verification, even longer. And I'll talk about employment verification here in a second. But the point is, each one of these steps takes time. Every time you add an additional step to a background check, it just makes the whole process take longer. And hiring managers, look, they get impatient. They want whomever they hired to start as soon as possible. In some industries, they're under even more pressure to get them in as soon as possible. They don't want to be told that they can have so-and-so, but they're going to have to wait another week or 2 weeks because the background check is still pending. In some industries, that's simply unacceptable. Again, what you're going to learn is that a lot of this is role and industry specific, company specific. Every company is different. So to have someone who is coming in for, let's say, like an entry-level job go through all of these steps, most small businesses just aren't going to do it. Now, keep in mind, if we were hiring for a mid-level role, a manager, someone with elevated responsibilities, and if we can afford these in-depth background checks, maybe someone who's going to have direct access to, let's say, cash or sensitive customer data, maybe there's a little bit of more of a higher risk there of exposure or of a leak of something. And in those circumstances, yeah, maybe we're going to spend more money on a background check, but it doesn't guarantee it. So again, a big part of this, it just depends on the nature of the role. And it makes sense, right? As a business, it's a question of risk. So that's why you hear some industries, certain job types have these in-depth background checks that look at just about everything. You think of cops, government contractors for the military, any government job, teachers, certain healthcare workers, certain financial institutions. These types of places are just likely to have higher standards for their background check process. Not all of them, but a lot of them may. Yet remember, the people who manage these processes are human. Humans make mistakes, they get lazy, humans get busy and forget to check things, humans look the other way. How far do you have to look really to find corruption, fraud, and all sorts of shenanigans within these institutions? So as a brief example, let's say I've made a decision to lie on my resume or my employment application. Does that mean it's going to get caught on the background check? Well, that depends on whether or not the company that hired me is even paying for an employment verification check to begin with. It also depends on how badly I lie. You see, let me open the window and explain this a bit. If I do an employment verification check on you, what does that actually mean? Well, oftentimes what it means is that I've taken the information you've given me from your application or your resume that tells me where you worked, your job title, and what dates you worked there. Then I give that to the background check company, right? The background check company is going to take that information and attempt to reach out to those companies and engage in an employment verification process. That means someone is going to call and try to get a hold of their HR department and ask them to verify their employment. Think this through. What happens if the company you worked for has gone out of business? Who is there to contact? Or what if they just can't get a hold of the company's HR person? What if they're unresponsive? What if they don't want to respond to the employment verification request, or maybe gets lost in the mail or in email spam? What will happen is that the background check company will simply say, we couldn't verify employment, right? It doesn't say they're lying. It's just we're not sure. So sometimes they'll ask for maybe a different form of proof, like a pay stub or an offer letter, or maybe a different contact number. You can certainly provide that. Eventually, though, as I mentioned earlier, all of this takes time. If you've done a great job during the interview to convince the hiring managers that you're the right person for the job, well, guess what? The hiring company is probably just going to let it slide. Not always, but they'll certainly be more willing to look the other way if you've been respectful and they think you're going to make a great employee. I can tell you that from the business side of things, it is hard to find good employees. Companies struggle with this all the time. And the more skilled you are as an employee, the more you bring to the table, the more qualified you are to do the job, the more pressure there is to find someone just like you that can do the job. I've seen companies ignore all sorts of red flags with a candidate and look the other way because they've invested so much up front, so much time and energy, doing these interviews and testing or whatever, just trying to find someone. That start over from scratch is just a bad idea all around, and nobody wants to have to deal with it, especially the hiring manager, because they're going to be under pressure to have someone do the job and do it well and do it quickly. So look, if you watch other YouTubers or read some article someone wrote online, they'll tell you you have to dot your I's and cross your T's, right? And make sure your application and resumes are perfect and you have all the right job titles and employment dates so that you don't fail the background check. But again, I'm here to tell you, they may not even do one to begin with. And if you're applying to one of those jobs I mentioned earlier in those industries, like maybe a teacher or a cop or something like that, then yeah, if I were coaching you, I'd tell you should probably be as accurate as possible. Again, it's case specific, but most people just aren't doing those jobs. I coached someone years ago, as an example, who worked as an administrative assistant, and she took on a job where her supervisor sexually harassed her. Well, she quit after 2 months. You better believe that she struggled with the question of whether or not she should put this job on her resume, right? And we know, as recruiters will tell you, you better believe that if a recruiter sees on a resume that you worked and held a job for 2 months, they're probably going to trash your resume. They're going to question, why did she leave, right? Why was she only there for 2 months? They probably got fired. And those are the types of things that go in a recruiter's head. That's what they're probably going to think, and they're going to eliminate that person, especially if you have 20 resumes for the same position and one of them had a 2-month stint at this job and it's questionable. Then why not go and interview the other 10 people who don't have that issue, right? So again, it's just something to keep in mind as you're trying to be competitive in the job market. So when she came to me, I told her, look, there's absolutely no reason you are obligated to keep that on your resume. Knock that out. That 2-month job, it didn't work out, whether it's fair or not. Most recruiters will trash that resume. So let's eliminate that from the resume. Let's get rid of it altogether. There's no reason to have it in there. That's exactly what she did. And then she had no problem landing a job, right? So look, I don't want to make this a resume video because that's a whole other thing, which if you guys want me to make a video on resumes, write me a comment in the comment section saying blow up resumes, and then I'll know that you want me to work on that. But my point is that sometimes in order to play the game and land the job, which you need to survive and pay the bills in this inflation-riddled recession of an economy we find ourselves in, you have to sometimes stretch the truth of it. I'm not saying it's something that you don't already know, right? I can't even get the words out of my mouth. There have been all sorts of studies out there that tell you people lie on resume. They stretch the truth. They upgrade their titles. They move some dates around. You have people who managed a broomstick, let's say in retail, and their resumes read like they managed a crew of 4 facility engineers. Maybe the broom, the trash can, the vacuum, and the mop. I'm not telling you to lie on your resume. This video is just for educational purposes. And I advise companies all the time to strengthen their background checks because I see all of the gaps, because if you were in their shoes, ultimately they want to hire the best people, right? And they want to hire someone who has the right experience that they claim to have. So this is just one of those risk measures that companies employ, right? But I can tell you there are all sorts of gaps. And on the employee side of things, look, if you know how to do the job, don't let this background check issue and resume process stop you from applying to places. Because if you can do the job and you're just trying to live your life, I want you to get the job, right? I want you to be successful. Don't let fear stop you from pursuing what you need in life. So let's talk about criminal history a bit. First, you should know that there are some states like California and even some cities like New York City or San Francisco or even San Diego where employers are restricted on a variety of things, like how far back on the criminal history they can even look back, what questions they can ask you, like about your criminal history or even your salaries, which is a whole other topic, or when they can ask them. All sorts of restrictions on what an employer might even consider when deciding whether or not they should move forward with hiring you after they get back the results for the background check. There are specific laws that employers are required to adhere to in these circumstances. And if you want to research them yourself, all of this information is available publicly. You can just Google your home state and background check laws and get a sense for what may apply to your unique situation. However, I can tell you that this is a little bit more of an exception, because for most states, you're not going to find anything when you Google your home state plus background check laws, because a lot of states just don't have much restrictions in place when it comes to this. Some of the bigger states like California and New York, though, will. And then there's the FCRA, which stands for the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which helps to ensure that the information that these background check companies put out there is accurate and private, amongst other things. Let's say, as an example, an employer decides not to move forward with offering you a job because of something on your criminal history background check. You're entitled to a copy of that report from the background check company, and you can dispute the information on there if there's some kind of factual error. For instance, I've seen reports come back showing criminal history or a conviction for something that occurred as a minor, or which was just altogether inaccurate, or maybe even subject to identity theft, and that should have not been reported on. Yet there it was on the criminal report. So a job applicant with that information would be able to then dispute it and remove that from the background check. I've also seen people who, when filling out a job application, will confess to everything under the sun, and they'll write out a long criminal history and say, hey, I have 3 to 4 convictions and this is what they are and this is what the circumstances were. And yet their background check only comes back with 1 of 2 convictions, which then poses the question as to why, right? Why did you just disclose so much that probably didn't need to be disclosed? And if you're serious about landing a job and you don't want this background check process to come back and bite you in the ass, you're probably better off doing some homework and finding out what exactly is on your background check. There are some companies out there that will allow you to do a background check on yourself so you can see what is out there. If you know what is on your background check, you'll be better equipped to navigate any future conversations about your background. You'll know what exactly you should or maybe shouldn't put on your application. You should also not just be so quick to give up if you have a criminal history and think that you won't be able to get a job anywhere, because that's not entirely true either. If you're trying to get your life together and that shit is in your past, you deserve a second chance. Most of you probably. If you're doing the right things, someone's going to give you a shot, but it's on you to carve the path out for yourself. I'll give you an example. Not that long ago, I saw someone who had a set of misdemeanor DUIs on their record, and they thought they were going to get turned down left and right from applying to jobs. But most of that was frankly just in their heads, because I worked with them and there were a number of things that we did. But first off, they had a couple things going for them. Like, they were applying to jobs that didn't require you to drive on the job in the first place. That already helps. You see, from the company side, when they get the results from the background check, someone is going to essentially review the results and they'll make a determination. If the company is big enough to have an HR department, maybe it's HR that does this. Other times it'll be the hiring manager, but they'll look at it, and based on the results, they'll make a determination. They'll make a judgment, right? Let's say you're applying to some desk job and your DUIs are from 2 years ago, as in this case of this person I was assisting. And frankly, when the results came back, it's like, why would the company even care? Frankly, it's a non-driving position. They have a clean history from 2 years ago, and they made it through the interviewing process because they have the right skills. Why would they be rejected at that point? Which again goes to my earlier point about companies needing good people. If you're not an asshole, if you're respectful, and the hiring team likes you as a person, they will vouch for you, and you'll get the shot you need to move forward with your life. There's a lot that you can get by just not being an asshole. So what about educational history? Let me start off by saying no one gives a shit if you graduated high school, except maybe you or your parents. Look, I've audited countless employers and not one bothered to check if their employees actually graduated high school. So if you feel like you can't apply to jobs because you never graduated high school and that's the situation that you find yourself in, don't worry about it, because frankly, no one's going to check. Obviously, doesn't mean can't have some natural ability, right? You have to be able to do the job, and you have to be able to work hard and smart. But that piece of paper alone shouldn't stop you. So get after it. What about college? Well, look, a lot of it depends on your job, what you do for a living. You know, you're not going to apply to be a software engineer and you don't have a degree and you don't know anything about coding. That probably isn't going to work out for you. Same thing, you're not going to apply to be a nurse if you don't have, a nursing degree. But not every position is like that, right? So it ultimately depends a lot on what you do for a living, the company you apply to, and the level of your job. But I can tell you that I've run into a lot of employers who just aren't spending the money to do background checks for educational history for a lot of jobs. Now, there's a variety of reasons for that. Let's face it, even most of the college graduates out there end up doing a job that has very little to do with the major that they picked. That's something. There's all sorts of articles and studies written about people who major in some liberal arts degree who end up doing something completely unrelated. And their college was, they start feeling like it was a scam, right? There's a reason why a lot of people start feeling like college is scammy. I personally spent close to like $100,000 getting multiple degrees. My master's degree is from one of the top universities in the world, and yet not one of my employers has ever bothered to run a background check to confirm I actually have it. Not once have I been asked to prove my degree. And you might think, well, maybe someone ran my background check and I just didn't know. Well, I work in HR. I know what went into my file. I can actually see my own reports. And I have seen my own reports. I run background checks on myself. I know what shows up and what doesn't. And I can tell you, no one's bothering to check. Like, WTF, man. Like, I know in my heart that I could be doing the job I'm doing now without the effort I made to get the degree. Is it a nice personal accomplishment I can be proud of? Do I wish I could get my money back and maybe at least half of it and go to Tahiti instead? Also, yes. I've seen it countless times. People who tell me they've never been asked to prove their educational background, and I'll see it on background check reports. And if that's you, feel free to drop a comment and let others know your story, because it matters, especially in today's economy. Does that mean you should claim you have a PhD and go apply to jobs you know you can't do? No. You don't want to commit fraud, right? You don't want to do that. And if you get caught doing something like that, you could really get yourself into trouble, right? Most likely lose your job in the process, which is another reason why everyone should always have a rainy day fund, because frankly, you could lose your job at any time for any number of reasons. I know, I've fired hundreds of people. It's my job, right? I know how these things play out. Most people work under at-will employment, and those are the cards that get dealt. If you want me to write or do a video on terminations, I can do that too. Just drop me a comment. Say terminations. At the end of the day, is it a risk worth taking? Only you can answer that. Maybe other people that you see in the comments will give you some ideas as to how things have worked out for them. I can't guide you on that. I'm just here to present the information as it stands. I also know that employers and a lot of hiring managers, even the most basic jobs, require degrees. And that's frankly a bunch of BS. You don't need a graduate degree for a customer service job earning $18 per hour. And I've sat on the other side and I've worked with hiring managers scrutinize why on their job description they're requiring degrees for a job that really doesn't require it, right? And I've tried to convince them otherwise. But some people get stuck in their heads and they're like, no, I want them to have a degree because of X, Y, and Z. And even though the job doesn't really need it, I'm not going to be able to convince them, right? It's just, again, another piece of the puzzle that I think is worth looking at. At the end of the day, this responsible YouTuber will tell you that you should always tell the truth, never lie, cheat, or steal. And when an employer asks you if you stole little Timmy's lunch box in the 7th grade, you should confess to it. That's it for now. Be sure to drop me a like and subscribe if you found any value in this video. Share it with your friends, and I'll see you on the next one.